Welcome to the Seven Figure Fundraising Podcast, the podcast where we discuss specific tactics and strategies to grow your nonprofit. I'm your host, Trevor Bragdon. In this episode, I talk with my brother and co-founder of the Seven Figure Fundraising Workshop, Tarren Bragdon. Tarren works as the CEO of the Foundation for Government Accountability, a nonprofit he started in 2011 with just $50,000 in seed money and has now grown to over $13 million in annual revenue. In this conversation, we dive into the important mindsets necessary to be a successful fundraiser and ask for seven-figure donations. Real quick before we get started, our team has a training coming up that you may be interested in. I'll share more details in a little bit, but for now, on to the show. In today's episode, we're looking at the most important mindsets you need as a successful fundraiser. So to start out, Tarren, why don't you tell us about your background? How'd you get involved in fundraising?
Well, my background is right out of college. I decided to run for the Maine legislature, and I was really interested in politics and policy. Served in the legislature a couple terms, then worked for the legislature, and then went to work for a policy organization doing policy research. And, I think my path to being the head of a nonprofit follows a lot of people's career paths in that you're working within a nonprofit. And in my case, the founder left after 5 years for another opportunity. And so the board talked to me about, hey, we like your work in this area. You don't have any experience in fundraising or managing people, but hey, they didn't say that part. That was just the reality. And then said, would you like to be the head of the organization? And I thought, great. And that was my first big leap into being a fundraiser, of really getting a job responsibility, having people on the payroll, and having as a primary responsibility something that, in hindsight, I didn't know a lot about, was really difficult, and was something that I struggled with for a long time.
And I think that's such an interesting story. And the people who have come through the workshop, these other nonprofit executives, a lot of them have followed a similar pattern. Why do you think it is that so many people get into leading a nonprofit but have no background in fundraising or fundraising training?
Well, I think that for a lot of people, they're passionate about the work of the nonprofit. And so they're oftentimes working in a position within a nonprofit, or maybe even as the founder of the nonprofit, based on, here's the impact that I could be having. If it was just a job, they would likely go to work in some other industry that put their talents to good work. But they're clearly purpose-driven. I think one of the things, though, is nobody teaches you how to fundraise well and how to avoid mistakes. But yet everybody kind of expects that you'll figure it out along the way, or, you'll spiral and decline. And so it's not really seen as a skill set. It's seen as something that you'll just figure out, rather than something that if you learn how to do it and do it well, your organization will take off. And you don't have to have a background in it, but you have to be willing to learn. Otherwise, you'll learn through the school of hard knocks.
Right, which is part of the reason we work together to create the seven-figure fundraising system, to help speed up that learning curve so you don't have to go through that school of hard knocks. For someone just has never heard of seven-figure fundraising, how would you describe the workshop?
I would describe the 2-day workshop of seven-figure fundraising, of taking what really took me a decade to learn, of how do you raise 5, 6, and 7-figure gifts from individuals and foundations, and to a lesser extent from corporations. How do you do that and package it up with a combination of what's the mindset and what's the skill sets that you need to be a successful fundraiser? And for CEOs, I would say that you need to recognize that the most important part of your job is fundraising, but it's probably an area that you haven't focused professional development on, even though it's the one thing that you could do that would have the biggest impact on your organization. So it's figuring that out over 2 days and really leaving with a concrete way to sell your organization to individuals who are not buying something. They're voluntarily choosing to give their money to support this mission, how to create that partnership with 5, 6, and 7-figure donors.
Right. And I think that's such a good point on why it's so much harder to fundraise than even sales, because they're not getting anything tangible back in return. In some ways, this is the most difficult form of sales, fundraising, but yet in the for-profit world, they spend all this money doing sales training and all of that sort of work to make sure you're an effective salesperson. But in the nonprofit world, training sometimes takes a back seat.
No, absolutely. In the for-profit world, everyone would recognize if I have better salespeople, it's higher revenue, it's higher profit, and that's what we're going to invest in. I think in the nonprofit world, we have a bit of this mindset of, I want to reduce administrative costs. Professional development is seen as an administrative cost, and you can just figure it out along the way. And the reality is, sometimes you can't figure it out on the way, or you just want to learn from people who have gone before and people who are living in your world on a day-to-day basis. I think that one of the things that is different about the nonprofit world was really driven home to me by a board member who is in the for-profit world. And he said, one of the things I think is, a lot of times people in the nonprofit world think that the for-profit world is harder. He said, frankly, I think the nonprofit world is harder, just for the point you made, Trevor, that in the for-profit world, someone's buying a specific product, whereas in the nonprofit world, someone is voluntarily giving their money to achieve a particular impact. And so if you can be really successful in the nonprofit world, I think you have an even more transferable skill set to not only accomplish the mission of your nonprofit, but also to just be more valuable as a professional.
Right. And I think one of the things, too, nonprofit leaders think, too, when they think about fundraising is to be more successful at fundraising, I need to have more donors. Why is that not the right mindset to have?
This is a great example of a lesson I've learned the hard way. When I was leading my first nonprofit back in Maine, before I moved to Florida, as you recounted, and started up the Foundation for Government Accountability and grew it to the $13 million in revenue we have today, 8 years later, I focused on getting new donors. And in 1 year, I increased the number of donors that we had by 25%. And so by a lot of measures, that was a wildly successful year. But by the measure of actual revenue in the door, we raised less money that year because we were focused on the wrong thing. We were focused on new donors, not focused on how do we get our current donors inspired by our bigger vision and bigger accomplishments. How do we get them to increase? And how do we add a handful of new major donors? If we had focused on that, we could have increased the number of major donors, which matters, and we could have increased our total revenue, which would have mattered even more.
Right. But no one actually sits down and tell you that, focus on your existing ones first, then move on and look at where new sources of revenue could come from.
No, Trevor, it's even worse than that. It's not that nobody sits down with you and tells you that. You actually have a lot of people specifically telling you the opposite. You have vendors who are saying to you, the key to your success is direct mail, that you want to prospect and bring in hundreds of small dollar people and find those diamonds in the rough. This is the way to do it. And you'll need to lose tens of thousands of dollars each year in order to have this strategy longer term that would be successful. It'd be like, somebody, making a pitch that the best way to lose weight would be to gain a few pounds really quickly, and then you'll have, an incentive to lose more. It's just, you have people specifically telling you to do something that is directly opposite with what actually works.
Right. That's such a good point on the whole, when you have someone like a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And it's not like that necessarily a direct mail vendor is, selling you something that doesn't work. It's just, it works in a very specific domain, and it matters on your scale, your size, the context of your nonprofit, on whether it makes sense to use that sort of strategy.
Absolutely.
So talk to us a little bit about this whole idea of the poverty mindset. It's something we discuss in the workshop quite a bit, and it really resonates with the students who attend. But tell us what the poverty mindset is and what it means when you're a nonprofit CEO.
Well, I think the poverty mindset is one of the things that most keeps nonprofits back, both nonprofit CEOs, a lot of nonprofit development directors, but even just nonprofits overall. A poverty mindset is when you focus on short-term costs rather than long-term gains. This was really driven home to me, candidly, by a donor who grew up in poverty, grew up in foster care. I introduced him to another nonprofit, and he said to me that he wouldn't invest in that nonprofit because that nonprofit leader had a poverty mindset, and that he recognized it because he grew up in poverty. And he made the same explanation that I just made of he's focused on short-term things, which often means micromanaging, rather than a long-term strategy and vision. I think about the poverty mindset in, a great example of this for folks who get on airplanes is, do you focus on buying Wi-Fi while you're on the airplane so you can be as productive as possible with sending emails and setting up meetings and things? Or do you say, I'm going to save $15 there, even though it might mean I lose 2 hours of productivity? It's that short-term thinking rather than a long-term mindset. It's the difference between surviving and thriving. A lot of times people who don't have a lot of money are great at surviving on $20 till the next payday. But a lot of people, whether they have money or not, struggle with, what do I need to do today so that I have a better life 9 months from now? Fundraising is all about that. If I don't do something today, I won't feel it, maybe for 6 months or 9 months. But by the time I feel it, it could be too late to recover. I think of another story of the poverty mindset from a student we had come through the workshop who was hired to run a nonprofit. And like a lot of CEOs, was told one story. And when he moved his family into this new state, took the job and actually dug into the books, he realized that they were really in a tough spot. In fact, they were so in a cash flow crisis that they weren't spending the money to replace light bulbs. And so think about this. Literally, people who were worried about whether or not they would have a paycheck at payday were working in a darker and darker environment as the light bulbs went out. And so one of the things that he did early on was spend money to replace the light bulbs. It was signaling, we don't have this poverty mindset. We're going to focus on having the light and focus, seeing the light, if you will, of actually focusing on the nonprofit and using some of the strategies from the workshop. He landed a $200,000 commitment from a donor that had been given far less. I think that it's a great example of when you shift the mindset and when you lay out a vision, that's what people want to respond to. People don't want to respond to desperation.
Right. Well, and what's interesting too is the nonprofit leaders are thinking about is they're trying to be responsible with their donors' money a lot of times when they have this short-term thinking, like they're trying to be good stewards, but they forget that for major donors, they want you to have the environment where you can have the most impact and be the most successful. So if that means buying the example you used of Wi-Fi on an airplane, they want you to do that. They want you to be effective in doing your job because they know you being effective allows you to accomplish the mission of your nonprofit.
Right. Another travel-related example of that might be, taking a red eye to save $100 and not thinking about the consequence of arriving for a high-stakes meeting or donor presentation or maybe just a speech, not rested. So that's a poverty mindset of focus on saving a few dollars rather than being in my best possible environment for this very high-stakes interaction.
Right. And that's such a key point with all the time you're spending to get there, all of the work to come to that meeting. But if you're not in a good mindset or in a good rested position, that 30 minutes or that 1 hour with the donor is wasted because all of those other hours you put in, you're not at your prime.
Right. Another example of the mindset might be, I'm on an irritating conference call or having a challenging phone conversation before I walk into one of those donor meetings. And so rather than being in the right mindset of focusing on this is a high stakes interaction with a really important person that will help define the future and impact of our organization, I'm trying to shove all these little things into every moment that I have rather than focusing on what matters the most and being excellent at that thing. Fundraising matters the most if you're the CEO. It's your top responsibility. Your organization will rise or fall on it. And so you want to just give it the time and attention it needs, not have a poverty mindset.
We'll get back to the interview in just a minute. But first, I want to tell you about our upcoming 7-Figure Fundraising Workshop, this February 26th through 28th in Alexandria, Virginia. We'll be teaching the 7-Figure fundraising system and how to grow your existing major donors and find new ones. This is an intimate workshop where we limit it just to 24 people so you can have one-on-one coaching so you can leave feeling confident, knowing exactly what to say at your next donor meeting. Here's what some of our past attendees have said.
Best thing I've ever done. I am so excited to have learned even more than I thought I could ever know. I've been reminded just how much I've forgotten about fundraising, about fundamental habits, developing consistency, thinking of new ways to attack the same problem. It's all covered in the 7-Figure Fundraising Workshops. I recommend them highly.
The coaching has been phenomenal, unlike anything I've been a part of in a dozen years of fundraising.
This workshop is crucial if you really want to grow your nonprofit, and it's worth the time, the energy, and the money because you're making a true investment into your nonprofit organization, and most importantly, into you, the person who's executing it. This is going to make my life a lot easier because now I have the tools necessary to be more successful.
To learn more, visit 7figurefundraising.com, where you can sign up for the workshop or schedule a call with me to answer any questions you have about the workshop. I hope you'll join us in February. Now, back to the interview. So shifting gears a little bit, one thing we hear when people are thinking about coming to the workshop or just talking with nonprofit leaders in general is they say something along the lines of, if only I had more resources, then we could do more big things. Or if we had more resources, then we could be even more effective. Can you talk to us a little bit about why that sort of thinking is actually a trap?
Well, I think that this is the thinking that happens with a lot of people. It's the reason why people play the lottery. We all think that if we had big money, then we'd be able to accomplish this big thing. For our nonprofit, it'd be, if I got big money, then I could have this big vision of here's what we'll do with this big money. But the reality is you'll never inspire those big gifts if you don't lay out and define that vision for your organization. And if you actually don't own the execution of that. So why would you expect donors to buy in to and give you big money unless they knew here's the big thing that it was going to accomplish? I think we don't think about the fact that people who have a lot of money have acquired it by doing big things. And with their philanthropy, they want to do the exact same thing. And so you have to lay out the roadmap, if you will, of here's where we want to go. You're a key part as a partner in this of getting there. And here's how we'd like you to financially contribute to make this happen. At the same time, I think one of the things that can get into this mindset of if only I had big money is you can feel a bit entitled. You're sitting down in front of somebody who, has several more zeros in their bank account than you have, or maybe even your organization has. And you could feel entitled to that money rather than recognize I'm not entitled to $1. I want to inspire this person, but we have a partnership where their big money and our big execution will mean big success based on this big vision that we've laid out. And this partnership that is a beautiful aspect of working in and running a nonprofit is a partnership with the donor, all based on this big vision. And then what are the two pieces to get you there? The two pieces are big money and big results, or execution to get those results.
So I want to dive a little more into what you just said there about the partnership role. You don't hear a lot of nonprofits talk about investments, like donors making investments in their organization, or talk about it in those terms. You don't often hear them talk about them as partners. What's the difference? Why do you think of them as a partner versus an investor or a donor? Like, why do you use that term specifically?
Well, I don't use the term investor because I had a donor specifically say, I know what an investment is. You're an expense. Don't tell me it's an investment. So I learned that lesson the hard way. That's what I thought too. Like, I'm using a word that means something very different. I think that with a partnership, it implies something very, very different. It implies that one person is providing one thing in the relationship and the other person is providing something complementary but different. And that's really what we're talking about with the relationship with 5, 6, and 7-figure donors, that it is your vision and their support that makes and your execution as a result of their support that makes this big impact possible. I think that if you think about the donor driving that vision, so not a partner, but then the nonprofit becomes a vendor, if you will. I, as a donor, have this big vision, and I'm going to pay somebody to do it. That's not a partnership. That's a vendor relationship. And donors might have a lot of different vendors in their lives. But what you want to be is a partner where you're laying out the vision of your organization. You're the practitioner, so you know how to do it. Yet at the same time, you need that partnership from donors to provide the support. It's something that is kind of cool and American, if you will, given what a philanthropic society we are and how we're one of the most charitable countries, or the most charitable country, in that thing is part of the ethos of who we are, but it's a really it's a different kind of business relationship. We just don't think about it as being as different as it is, but it's very cool. And we see the value of partnerships in a lot of other aspects of our life, with our spouse, with other business opportunities. We just don't think about the donor partnership being structured in a similar way.
Right. And they partner with people all the time, whether it's an investment, another business opportunity. Like, these are highly successful people running big organizations. Like, partnership is something they do continually. So it makes sense that would transfer over into the nonprofit space.
What you just said is so key in understanding the mindset of a donor. I was talking with a donor recently who has a big portfolio of companies. He actually said he has 57 different companies that he invests in. He has 57 examples of how a partnership works. Sometimes he directly, impacts that partnership with his own expertise, but most of the time it's through his money and connections. And that's the exact same kind of relationship that you have with a 5, 6, or 7-figure donor as a nonprofit leader.
Right. And this reminds me of one of the stories you tell during the workshop about the donor telling you that they actually have trouble giving away money. You want to share that story?
So this is one of these moments where sometimes you're sitting in the room and you're thinking, I want to make sure my expression doesn't come across wrong. So I was sitting with a donor in California who said to me, is somebody in commercial real estate, big commercial investments, lots of them. And he said to me, I find it's easier to make money than it is to give it away. And there have been some billionaires who have said something similar. And I think that might sound almost incredible to us in the nonprofit world where we're trying to raise money. Like, giving away money seems like the easiest thing possible. But from their perspective, they're always assessing a partnership opportunity based on the return, based on the results, and the metric that is important to them. That metric might be profitability. That metric might be jobs created. It might be a whole host of different things, or getting into a new industry, or having a complementary business that complements something else that they invest in or partner with. But in the nonprofit world, that partnership is exactly what you're trying to accomplish. It's a long-term relationship. It's not a one and done project that you're doing. It's a long-term partnership, and it's a very, very familiar framework for them.
And what you've found is major donors tend to invest in the nonprofit CEO, and it's very personality driven in a lot of ways.
It is. It is both. They're investing in leadership as well as in what the organization can accomplish. And they recognize that the leader is a part of that, even though it's, it might be literally hundreds of people. In the case of our organization, we have just under 30 employees who are executing on that. So it's both the combination of leadership and vision, and then the actual people who are executing it. I had a foundation explain it to me this way, which I thought was a really clever way to think about it. They invest in chefs, not restaurants. This is particularly true for early organizations or organizations that have had a change in leadership. And so I think it's important to recognize that's why you, as the head of the organization, need to be the driving force in fundraising, because the people who are giving you money recognize that it's the most important job of the CEO. If you look at successful for-profit businesses as well as nonprofit businesses, the CEO is a key driver in the sales, particularly in high-stakes sales. It's the number one track that CEOs come through in the for-profit world is sales. And so the same is true in the nonprofit world. Not that you have to come through a development track to be a nonprofit CEO, but you have to be great at fundraising and recognize this to your most important job. And you can try to deny that, but the fact is clear. If you do this one thing well, the rest of your life is better. And I can, from personal experience, tell you, if you don't do this one thing well, then your entire world is dark, and you can quickly get to the edge of bankruptcy for your organization.
Right. That whole chef's not restaurants, I think, is such a key point for people to remember, because it's also they see potential in you. Like if you're explaining a big vision, you might not actually know quite how the actual steps are going to play out to get there. You know, you're going to figure it out, you're going to do the work, but they know and have confidence in your ability to try things and change and move that company or move your nonprofit to be successful.
Absolutely. And you think about just keeping with the restaurant framework, a restaurant is either known for its lead chef and its innovative menu as a direct result, or they're a franchise and they're known for being really, really consistent at delivering a high quality product. So they're either known for the system and their results or their leadership. And the nonprofit is no different. It starts out with leadership, and then part of being a good leader is delivering consistent results as you grow and scale.
So shifting gears a little bit, why do you think so many people and nonprofit leaders are uncomfortable asking for money?
I think that they don't know what to say. Usually we're uncomfortable doing things because we feel like we're not good at it. And we feel like that probably because we don't know what to say and we're not good at it, we don't like doing it. Most of us want to do things that we're good at. I think one of the things that's exciting about seeing folks go through the workshop is you realize if you're in this position, you're passionate about the work. And usually what you need is just what are the words that explain why you're passionate and what you're selling. And then once you get comfortable with that, you're really comfortable with sitting down in front of people and inspiring them to give for the first time, or more importantly, to give more as an established donor. And so I would just say that most people are uncomfortable with it just because they don't know how to do it. But once you know how to do it and do it well, you realize, okay, I can do this, I can excel at it. And it's not something you're born with. It's just a skill you learn, like so many other skills. But you can easily learn it.
And when you say they don't know what to say, are you talking about specifically the actual part of the ask or how they're presenting all of the information?
Yes. So I would say that it's both pieces of it. Of how am I presenting it? How do I actually get to the ask? How do I communicate a more complicated thing that is my big organization? Or if you're in a startup at the other extreme, how do I communicate this big goal and desire even as I'm taking the first steps? And then how do I actually ask for money? It might seem intimidating, but it's just a process that you can do. And I think that's why you have a lot of CEOs that try to focus on other things rather than do this one thing really well. And the fact is that once you get good at it, it takes as much time to ask for $100,000 as it does for $1,000. And so
what do you mean by that?
Do it, meaning like if I'm going to sit down with you and ask you for money, it takes just as much time to sit down with somebody who has the capacity to give a lot of money and ask them for a lot as it does to sit down with somebody who, whether they have capacity or not, you're only asking them for a small amount, which is why we focus on the reality that 5% of donors drive 95% of the revenue or the donations at most nonprofits. And so you want to focus on how do you grow that 5% and inspire them to give more. And then at the same time, how do you add a handful of new folks to that 5% each year as part of a long-term strategy to grow your organization?
So as a final question, Tarren, if you could go back in time 10 years and talk to yourself when you're first starting as a nonprofit leader, what advice would you give yourself about fundraising?
If I could go back in time, I think what advice I would give myself is I would say, as head of a nonprofit, learning how to fundraise is the most important thing that you can focus on. So learn it well now, right from the start, because your life will be a lot better off if you can. And just to put this in context a little bit, when I moved to Florida and started up the organization that I run now, just literally 8 years ago this month, my big goal was to create and run a $2 million organization, because I had run a $1 million organization, an organization I had grown to over $1 million back in Maine. So my big goal was to do something double. I heard this woman talk about how most people overestimate what they can accomplish in a year and underestimate what they can accomplish in 10 years. I would have never guessed that in 8 years that I would be leading this $13 million enterprise. But that was mostly driven by getting the fundamentals of fundraising right, recognizing that it's my most important job as a CEO and focusing on it, and then innovating periodically along the way. And that's what we teach in the 7-Figure Fundraising Workshop, is getting that one thing right. And I think what's interesting to think about is, if I could go back in time when I first became a CEO 11 years ago and have gotten it right, where would I be today? Well, it doesn't really matter what the answer to that question is now, because it's an exciting place to be in today with just the kind of impact that we're able to have, because now I have the mindset and skill set as a fundraiser. And what's exciting is to talk to other passionate CEOs of nonprofits who want to put their own dent in the universe, and to give them that same sort of mindset and skill set so that they can have a big impact. You know, if America and the world had millions of high-functioning, well-funded nonprofits, we'd be living in a much better place. And it's exciting to help people learn that at the same time living it and doing fundraising meetings day to day. You know, I had 2 7-figure asks earlier this week. This is the world I live in. And it's fun to innovate, share those innovations, but also to teach people some of the tough lessons learned so that they can learn them in a 2-day workshop rather than learn them over 10 years like I had to.
Right. And that's such a unique aspect of the workshop, is it is taught by someone who's doing this every day. So you can see what works, what doesn't, and find out not from something that worked 10 years ago, but something that's working today with major donors in the nonprofit world. Tarren, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about 7-Figure Fundraising and our training, visit 7figurefundraising.com. Finally, if there's one person you know would benefit from hearing this episode, please take a minute and share it with them. Thanks.